Perhaps you've been assigned the task of analyzing the ways in which gender and power intersect in the ancient world. This online tutorial is intended to provide you an example with how you might want to consider going about exploring this set of ideas. Now, we know that when we look at artwork that we want to, and we absolutely have to, consider the context, the set of ideas surrounding the production of the work. Now, we're looking at this image that depicts a pharaoh and his queen, so it's a pretty safe conclusion to say that we're looking at a political image. Now, with that in mind, I would suggest that you might want to think about doing a little research and seeing what you can find out about the political system and how it might apply to this representation of the king and queen that you see here. Now, of course, your paper is not going to be very long, and there are entire books that are dedicated to this subject. So you can't really speak at length about this, but you may find some information that might work to support some of the interpretations that you will come up with once you look more closely at this image. The pharaoh and both the queenship, these are both political offices, so they're both reflecting political power. This is a great sculpture for us to look at because it includes both a man and a woman. We can see how these conceptions of power are similar and different based on gender. Now, the similarities, this can be pretty straightforward because they are unified together in one composition. There's a visual unity as well as a conceptual unity, and that unity sort of reflects that notion of sameness. So when we look at them, okay, first of all, the fact that we even see them memorialized in stone, that alone is an indication of power. Because in the ancient world, and there are some exceptions, but in general, it was only the wealthy and therefore the powerful that had their images recorded in art. So the fact that they're present, that indicates a level of power. We can also look at the material. Okay, so this material that we see here, it's slate, it's a stone. What kind of symbolism or associations can we attach to stone that might be something that would support this notion of power? And this is something that we can apply to both the man and the woman, the king and the queen, because they're both depicted in this same material. So we want to think about the symbolism of stone, right? Associations that we can make with this material. Now, we also see things like the fact that they are both depicted with foot stepping forward. And this is an active stance. They're in the process of moving. That motion is frozen. And so it's this idea that they are actively engaged in ruling over Egypt, that it's not passive, that they have this role that is actively participatory. And so we can argue that it's sort of an active power, that they work to rule over Egypt and have an active hand in that, and both of them. Another thing that we might want to think about is, where was this located? So this would be another opportunity to do further research. Might the location of this sculpture work in some way to further convey shared notions of power? Now let's talk about some of the differences. We'll talk about the king, the pharaoh, first. Now I do think it's worth noting that when we do compare the stepping forward, that he is stepping forward much farther, right? His foot kind of comes before hers if you look down here. So you could argue that perhaps he's more active and more involved in his ruling over Egypt than she is, that she's a little bit more passive in that sense, especially in the sense that this longer dress sort of restricts that movement of her leg. Now when we compare the clothing, you're going to see that he's wearing a short kilt. This kilt is short, which allows for him, as I pointed out, to have that larger gait, that wider gait. It allows for that sense of action, right? Reinforces that notion of active involvement in rulership. My own interpretation is that I do read this as phallic in nature, considering the placement and considering the appearance. And we know, we've talked about this multiple times in class, that phallic symbols are a representation of power, and usually that power is a masculine power. What other things could convey this notion of masculine power? How about the idea that he is muscular, right? That idea that there is a physical power here, in addition to, an intellectual power or whatever else. So physically he is powerful. We learned about in class too this idea of the idealized form of the pharaoh, that the pharaoh's body type was particularly idealized in very specific ways, so that when people looked at these images, it was very clear that they were looking at a pharaoh and not some other high-ranking Egyptian. So you can argue that the idealization of form and this kind of immediate identification as a pharaoh could be a representation of power, especially considering, again, that part of that idealization includes this idealized musculature. Now, also, a couple other things, okay? We notice that he's wearing a headdress. We know from our class that headdresses are significant, that this is a very important part of interpretation. This is where iconographical analysis comes in. So what you would want to do, because you know this is part of iconographical analysis, is you would want to do some research. What particular headdress is he wearing here? What particular ideas does this headdress express? And how can you connect that to notions of power? We also see that he's wearing the false beard. This is also an iconographic symbol of pharaonic power. It relates to the god Osiris. Now we know, we've talked about this in class as well, that very commonly leaders will align themselves with the gods, close associations, to further perpetuate notions of power. And we can see that the pharaoh is doing that here. Now let's take a look at the female here to see how she has different notions of power attached to her based on gender. Now first of all, she's wearing a wig. How can I tell that? You can actually see her hair right in here. She's wearing a wig, so she's not wearing a headdress. So this actually is sort of a lesser form of headwear, just simply the wig. Now the wig can be interpreted as cosmetic attractiveness, and so it can be this idea that her sexuality or even her visual appeal could be her form of power. This is something that, I think warrants some critique, right? This idea when we're talking about power, this guy's powerful because he's strong, it's a physical power. This woman's powerful because she's beautiful. It seems like a lesser conception of power. So she has that cosmetic attractiveness. We also see a level of attractiveness in the treatment of her form. Notice that she does not have that idealized treatment of form that we see with the pharaoh. She's not muscular, but she's kind of fleshy, and she's sort of soft in this sort of, ideally feminine way that's, of course, stereotypical. So she has this kind of idealized feminine treatment of the form. What this also does, though, is if you can see, the sheath of the dress reveals the shape of the breasts, and also very clearly reveals this pubic area as well. Now, when we think about reproduction, right, breasts and the genitalia obviously factors in quite significantly. Perhaps her power comes from her reproductive capabilities, where she gains power because she's going to be able to produce heirs for the king. If you do research on this, you'll find that this is kind of a lesser but yet not lesser power. This was how queens were able to achieve power. They were able to use their status as, mother to the king to sort of maneuver into higher expressions of power. So again, it's lesser, but it is a type of avenue of power that was available for these women. Now we can also comment on the gesture. This gesture is interesting. It makes it seem as though she's supportive. So he's the one that's kind of in charge of ruling over Egypt, and she sort of supports him. Again, the supporting role, the lesser sort of secondary role in presiding over Egypt. And maybe this is when you can kind of factor in this leg, that yes, they both actively participate, but her active participation is in a secondary supporting role. So that's something to consider. One other thing that I just thought of that I didn't mention before in terms of similarity is take a look at the hierarchical scale here. It's relatively equal. And so that can be another argument of some level of shared power in the sense that they're both the same size. Now, I do want to say this in terms of conclusions. First of all, this representation of a queen at this time period in the Old Kingdom period, extremely, extremely rare. We do not tend to see at this time these very visible images of queens, and really we do not see images where there is this suggestion that the queen's power rivals or perhaps is just only slightly less powerful than the king. So this is rare. There is an exception, though, when you go to the 18th dynasty and a little bit into the 19th dynasty. These notions of power appear then, and that's during the New Kingdom period. But in terms of the Old Kingdom and even into the Middle Kingdom period, this is very, very rare. So that would be something, if I was writing this paper, that I would note. I guess my conclusion would be that this is a rarer image of female power, but yet it seems to be kind of a lesser amount of power. The pharaoh is clearly powerful, he's active, he's strong, he rules over Egypt, and the queen is there to support those pharaoh's endeavors.